Lies do not begin with words. They begin with tone, with posture, with what suddenly becomes unsayable. Empires don't wake up one day and decide to deceive everyone. The shift is quieter than that. At first, nothing important seems to change. The institutions are still standing. The flags are still flying. The speeches still sound familiar. But the relationship between reality and narrative starts to loosen, almost imperceptibly. In healthy systems, stories are constrained by facts. Events happen first, explanations come second. But when an empire begins to weaken, that order quietly reverses. The explanation starts to come first. The story is prepared in advance. Reality is expected to follow. This is the moment when language changes its job. Words stop describing what is happening and start managing how it feels. Economic stagnation becomes temporary adjustment. Social tension becomes isolated incidents. Strategic failure becomes long-term positioning. Each phrase is technically defensible, yet emotionally misleading. Nothing is an outright lie. That's what makes it effective. People sense this before they understand it. You hear it in conversations where certainty fades, where official statements feel strangely smooth, almost rehearsed, even when events are chaotic. The more unstable things become, the calmer the messaging sounds. That contrast is not accidental. It's a signal. Historically, this is one of the most reliable early warnings of imperial decline. Rome did it. Late-stage empires always do. Not by inventing false realities overnight, but by slowly editing the truth, removing sharp edges, softening consequences, reframing losses as transitions. Over time, citizens are no longer reacting to events themselves, but to a curated interpretation of them. The danger isn't that people are fooled forever. The danger is that they adapt. When narratives grow increasingly disconnected from lived experience, individuals stop expecting honesty. Cynicism replaces trust. And once that happens, truth itself loses power. Facts no longer shock. Revelations no longer mobilize. Everything becomes noise. This is when lies stop needing to be convincing. They only need to be consistent. Empires at this stage are not trying to persuade skeptics. They are trying to stabilize the undecided. The goal is emotional regulation, not belief. Keep anxiety manageable. Keep outrage fragmented. Keep confusion high enough that no single explanation feels solid. You can see this pattern repeat across history. Declining empires rarely collapse under external pressure alone. They collapse internally when their narratives can no longer align people with reality. When citizens begin to live in two worlds at once, the official story and the one they experience every day. At first, those worlds coexist. People joke about the gap. They roll their eyes at official statements. But over time, the gap widens, and maintaining the illusion requires more effort, more messaging, more repetition, more emphasis on unity, resilience, patience. That's when honesty becomes dangerous. Not because the truth is unknown, but because it threatens the fragile structure holding everything together. When systems depend on belief rather than performance, transparency becomes destabilizing. So the truth is delayed, deferred, buried under context and qualifiers. This is a point most people misunderstand. Empires don't lie because they are evil. They lie because they are afraid. Afraid of accelerating loss of control. Afraid of triggering reactions they can no longer manage. Afraid that if people fully understand the situation, they will stop cooperating. And cooperation is the last real asset a declining empire has. Once it begins to erode, no amount of narrative control can restore it. But before that happens, the system will try everything else, especially language, because lies at this stage are not meant to deceive. They are meant to delay. Once narratives take priority over reality, institutions begin to change their behavior. Decision-making shifts away from outcomes and toward optics. What matters is no longer whether a policy works, but whether it can be defended, framed, and repeated without causing friction. The system starts rewarding those who manage perception better than those who solve problems. This creates a subtle but dangerous feedback loop. Leaders receive filtered information, shaped to protect careers and reputations. Data is softened before it travels upward. Bad news is delayed, diluted, or contextualized until it loses urgency. Over time, the center of power becomes less aware of conditions on the ground, even as it insists it understands them better than anyone else. At this stage, truth doesn't disappear. It becomes inconvenient. Analysts still see the numbers. Experts still understand the risks, but their role quietly shifts. Instead of asking what is happening, they are asked how to present what is happening. Language becomes a buffer between reality and authority. This is when contradictions multiply. Official confidence rises at the same time that systems strain. Reassurance becomes constant. Emergency measures are described as routine. Temporary exceptions linger indefinitely. Each adjustment is justified in isolation, yet the overall direction becomes harder to explain. People begin to notice patterns, not necessarily the fact themselves, but the way explanations repeat. The same phrases appear across different crises. The same promises of normalization, stabilization, resilience. When everything is framed as under control, nothing feels believable anymore. Psychologically, this produces a strained paralysis. Individuals sense that something is wrong, but lack a clear reference point. Conflicting messages blur accountability. If outcomes are always blamed on external shocks or historical complexity, responsibility dissolves. Frustration grows without a clear target. This is not accidental. Diffuse responsibility protects power. When causes are abstract, responses become passive. People wait. They adapt privately. They lower expectations. Public energy drains away, replaced by quiet resignation. Empires rely on this phase. It buys time. As long as citizens remain uncertain rather than unified, the structure holds. The danger for the system is not dissent, but clarity. Clear understanding leads to coordination. Coordination leads to pressure. So narratives are layered. Complexity is emphasized. Simple explanations are dismissed as naive. Doubt is framed as sophistication. The more confusing the situation becomes, the less likely people are to act collectively. History shows this pattern repeating with unsettling consistency. Late Soviet messaging, late Roman decrees, collapsing colonial administrations. Each believed that controlling interpretation could compensate for declining performance. For a while it works, but the cost is cumulative. Trust doesn't vanish all at once. It erodes. Small inconsistencies accumulate. Credibility thins. Eventually, people stop listening not because they disagree, but because they no longer expect honesty. At that point, the empire hasn't fallen yet, but it has lost its voice. And once authority can no longer communicate truthfully, it can only command compliance through force or fear. That transition marks the beginning of the end, even if everything still looks normal on the surface. Normalcy becomes performance. Stability becomes theater, and silence spreads where accountability once lived inside public institutions everywhere. As trust weakens, people change the way they listen. Messages that once guided behavior now pass through layers of skepticism. Citizens don't necessarily reject what they're told. They reinterpret it. Official statements are no longer taken at face value, but read as signals, clues, or defensive moves. Meaning shifts from content to tone. This is where psychological distance sets in. Individuals remain physically inside the system while mentally stepping outside it. They follow rules selectively, hedge decisions, and build parallel interpretations of reality. Public life becomes performative. Private life becomes adaptive. When an empire reaches this stage, it begins speaking to an audience that no longer believes it is being addressed honestly. Communication turns one-directional. Feedback loops break. Leaders speak, but no longer hear. Applause remains, but conviction disappears. The most dangerous part is that this decay is invisible in traditional metrics. Institutions still function. Markets still open. Elections still occur. The machinery moves, but meaning drains out of it. Symbols remain intact while their authority fades. Psychologically, people compensate by narrowing their focus. Long-term thinking declines. Planning gives way to coping. Individuals concentrate on personal stability, short horizons, immediate circles. This is not apathy. It is self-preservation. Empires misread this retreat as stability. Lower protest levels are interpreted as satisfaction. Reduced engagement is framed as maturity or trust. In reality, it reflects disengagement. When belief collapses, participation becomes optional. At this stage, storytelling intensifies. Narratives grow more polished, more emotional, more moralized. Language sharpens into binaries. Loyalty is praised. Doubt is pathologized. Questioning motives are scrutinized rather than questions themselves. The psychological pressure fractures society internally. People don't argue about facts anymore. They argue about identities. Information becomes tribal. Agreement depends on belonging, not evidence. This fragmentation protects the center temporarily, but weakens the whole. Historically, this phase is marked by an explosion of commentary and a collapse of clarity. Everyone talks. Few listen. The noise gives the illusion of debate while avoiding resolution. Systems drift. Eventually, a tipping point approaches. Not a dramatic event, but a quiet shift. People stop expecting coherence from institutions altogether. They no longer wait for explanations. They act independently, sometimes rationally, sometimes not. Once this threshold is crossed, recovery becomes extremely difficult. Trust cannot be commanded back. It must be rebuilt slowly through consistency and accountability. Empires in decline rarely have the time or humility for that process. Instead, they push harder on messaging. Volume replaces substance. Repetition replaces persuasion. Authority leans on enforcement rather than legitimacy. From the outside, the empire still appears powerful. Inside, it is hollowing. The words keep coming, but they no longer anchor reality. They float above it, detached, weightless, ignored. This is how collapse advances without spectacle, not through chaos, but through quiet psychological withdrawal. The system remains standing long after people have stopped believing in it. When belief erodes this far, power begins to rely on enforcement rather than consent. The shift is subtle at first. Rules become more detailed. Penalties become more visible. Language tightens. What was once framed as cooperation is now framed as obligation. Compliance replaces participation. Institutions justify this shift by pointing to disorder. Any instability, however minor, is amplified as proof that stronger control is necessary. The narrative becomes circular. Pressure creates resistance. Resistance justifies more pressure. Over time, this dynamic normalizes coercion. Psychologically, this marks a breaking point. People stop internalizing rules as shared values. They obey externally while detaching internally. This separation creates constant low-level stress. Individuals learn to say the right things, signal agreement, and hide dissent. Public conformity masks private divergence. Empires often mistake this silence for unity. The absence of visible opposition is treated as success. But beneath the surface, trust has been replaced by calculation. Every interaction becomes transactional. Every rule is followed only as far as necessary. At this stage, information control intensifies, not necessarily through censorship, but through saturation. So much content floods the public space that the summit becomes exhausting. Important issues are buried under trivial debates. Attention fragments. Fatigue sets in. Fatigue is useful to declining power. Tired populations are easier to manage. When people are overwhelmed, they stop demanding clarity. They accept ambiguity as normal. Confusion becomes background noise. Historically, this phase is marked by growing distance between formal authority and lived experience. Official statements sound increasingly disconnected from daily reality. Policies are announced that don't align with what people see or feel. The gap widens. This disconnect creates a moral fracture. Citizens begin justifying small violations as necessary adaptations. Rules lose their ethical weight. Survival logic takes over. Once this happens, restoring legitimacy becomes nearly impossible. Empires sometimes attempt reform here. New faces appear. Rhetoric softens temporarily. But without structural change, trust does not return. People interpret reforms as cosmetic, not corrective. As enforcement expands, errors multiply. Systems become rigid. Flexibility disappears. Mistakes that once could be corrected now cascade. Each correction requires new rules, more oversight, deeper intrusion. Psychologically, fear replaces belief as a stabilizing force. Fear can maintain order, but it cannot create loyalty. It drains creativity, initiative, and resilience. Societies held together by fear appear strong, but are structurally brittle. This is when collapse accelerates, even if nothing dramatic occurs. The system becomes heavy, slow, and fragile. It reacts rather than adapts. It enforces rather than inspires. From the outside, it still projects authority. Inside, it relies on pressure to hold together. The lie at this stage is no longer about prosperity or stability. It is about control being permanent. History shows this is a final illusion before systems break. Not because people rise up all at once, but because they stop carrying the structure emotionally. When belief is gone, power must hold itself up alone. And power alone is never enough. At the final stage, collapse no longer needs an external shock. The structure is already unsupported from within. Systems continue operating, but only through inertia. Procedures repeat because they have always repeated. Authority persists because nothing has yet replaced it. What disappears first is not order, but meaning. People stop asking whether institutions are legitimate and start asking whether they're avoidable. The question quietly shifts from "is this true?" to "how much does this affect me?" Once that shift happens, the collective framework dissolves into individual strategies. Survival replaces participation. Empires often misinterpret this moment. They look for rebellion, riots, or dramatic rupture. When those don't appear, they assume stability has returned. In reality, the absence of resistance signals exhaustion, not acceptance. A population that no longer believes has little reason to confront. It simply disengages. This is where decline becomes irreversible. Rebuilding trust will require transparency, accountability, and humility. But systems that have relied on narrative control cannot suddenly admit error without undermining themselves. The truth has been delayed too long. When it finally surfaces, it no longer heals. It confirms betrayal. Historically, this phase precedes sudden unraveling, not because people plan collapse, but because no one prevents it. When a crisis emerges, coordination fails. Institutions issue instructions that no longer carry authority. Citizens respond late, partially, or not at all. The collapse itself often looks accidental. A financial break, a logistical failure, a political deadlock. Observers blame incompetence, mismanagement, or bad luck. But the real cause lies earlier, in the long erosion of trust and the replacement of truth with performance. Empires fall when words stop anchoring reality, when promises are assumed false by default, when explanations are treated as distractions. At that point, power speaks, but no one listens. This is why the end rarely looks like the end. There is no single moment to point to, no clear announcement, just a gradual realization that the system no longer commands belief. And without belief, coordination collapses. History does not repeat exactly, but it rhymes with uncomfortable precision. Every empire that prioritized narrative over reality followed this path, not because leaders were uniquely corrupt or foolish, but because systems reward appearance over substance for too long. The lesson is not abstract. It applies to institutions, markets, and societies alike. Truth delayed is not truth preserved. It compounds damage. It widens the gap between words and experience until that gap becomes unbridgeable. Collapse, then, is not a sudden failure. It is the final consequence of prolonged dishonesty. By the time it becomes visible, the decision has already been made years earlier. If there is any value in understanding this pattern, it is not prediction, but awareness. Awareness changes behavior. It sharpens perception. It restores individual agency in systems that quietly depend on disengagement to survive. And if this perspective helped you see current events differently, stay with the channel. The next videos continue mapping these patterns, not to spread fear, but to restore clarity where narratives have replaced reality.